Hi everyone, my name is Nicole O'Gale and I'm going to be giving a presentation on psychoeducational assessment. So in this presentation we're going to go through the cognitive assessment that's usually within a psychoeducational assessment and understand what it measures and how that might impact a child in the classroom. We'll talk a little bit about the interpretation of scores for the cognitive assessment, what scores are significant. Briefly, we'll touch on the concept of learning styles. We'll look at the cognitive profile of a slow learner and how to program for those children in the classroom. We're going to look at academic assessments relatively briefly, as well as what abilities they measure outside of the academic skills that we know that they look at. And then finally, what to look at in a psychoeducational report. This is generally what a psychoeducational assessment is. It's a bunch of tests, but more than that, it is a full assessment. So there's observation, there's history taking, gathering information from parents and teachers, maybe other professionals involved in the child's life. And the goal is to enhance the understanding about how the student learns, how they process information, and their potential level of functioning. When we're looking at having a psychoeducational assessment done for the school board here at Chinook's Edge, we often consider a few things to make sure that the assessment is useful past the year when it was completed. We always want to avoid an assessment that can't say anything for certain because there's some transient factors happening. We always want to make sure that is the most useful assessment that it can be. So a couple things to consider when we want to decide when to do an assessment. The first one is age and grade. So around age 10, cognition is relatively stable, so meaning that the cognitive processes that the child has are likely theirs for life. Whereas if we're under 10, there's a lot of development, brain development and change going on, that it would be difficult to say that that would be the intellectual or cognitive capacity that that student would have, especially as they go into adolescence and adulthood. So typically around age 10, we can make that generalization. The other one that we look at is RTI. So many of you are familiar, response to intervention, making sure that we are providing the student with intervention, kind of our base level and going up our pyramid there. Making sure some of that has taken place before we go into an assessment to see if that is really what would help support that student. They just needed more practice, more intervention, maybe more one-on-one teaching. We also want to consider other factors like environmental factors. Something like a life transition would be something to consider. Maybe not doing an assessment around that time. If the child has just moved, maybe they have a sick relative, or they arrived at a new school, or maybe they have medical concerns themselves. Those would be really personal and environmental factors that would maybe signal that we don't want to do assessment right away because there's so much change going on in that child's life. When we look at why we want to do an assessment, really at most school divisions, including ours, we do an assessment to inform programming. As a school division, we access multiple data points to help inform programming and instructional interventions for our students. For example, we use academic assessments that focus on literacy and numeracy, classroom assessments to help determine student success, access to curriculum. Psychoeducational assessments are really a specialized assessment that we use to serve a specific function within our school. These assessments are really limited to highly specialized situations where our classroom and academic assessments are unable to adequately support programming. Our teachers do a wonderful job at programming for students even if they don't have an assessment, and we are not using assessments, the psychoeducational assessments, for diagnostic purposes or determining support within a classroom. Our teachers are really good at doing that without that information. It's really when we've tried so many things and it's just not working, that's when we look at a psychoeducational assessment. The next part I wanted to talk about is consent. So as you see this cartoon, this would not be fantastic because it would be missing informed consent. And obviously going through the process of a psychoeducational assessment, consent is very important. When we're looking at consent, there is a difference between just providing consent and providing informed consent. Informed consent means something quite different. It doesn't mean or not only means that the parents and people involved with the child know that the assessment is going to occur, but they're really informed about certain parts. They know what to expect along the way, the process. They know how to follow up if they have any questions or concerns. They know how the information is going to be shared or stored, and with who. They know the possible outcomes of the assessment, especially if we're looking at different diagnoses. They know how to stop the assessment if they don't want that assessment anymore. An assessment is a voluntary process, so they're able to say, I don't want that anymore. That's very much in their control. And we want to make sure that that's what the parents are understanding for an assessment. When we're doing a psychoeducational assessment, this is more mandatory than when we're doing things like level B assessments throughout our division, but that's just typically the assessment process that I go through after all of our referral process is completed. In this presentation, I'll talk about the second cognitive assessment there, the WISC. And I talk about this one because it is within that age range, you see 6 to about 16, that we would do assessments for the school division anyway. So there's just some other cognitive assessments there that you might have seen on a report, you might be familiar with, just to have different age ranges there. We have the younger assessment, an adult assessment, and then you might have seen the nonverbal scale, just for students who are nonverbal. But we'll be focusing on the WISC, and the Wechsler scales are really just the most widely used measures of intelligence. And I am going to give an analogy for the WISC. It's from the WISC-5 Assessment Interpretation. There's a book, and it gives a really good analogy of all of the different areas that it looks at for the cognitive assessment. So it talks about a team of 5 people that make up our brain, and those 5 team members work together in concert to make up our brain functions. They all have important roles in the brain, and they all really work together to create our cognitive functioning. So the 5 team members that they say are in our brain are the librarian, the architect, the general manager, the clerk, and the detective. So we're going to go through each of those. I think it's just a good analogy. It's not perfect, but it's a pretty good analogy to go through just to help with understanding. And if you're reading the assessment, it just kind of gives you something to anchor your knowledge to. So our first index is the verbal comprehension index. This is what they refer to as the librarian. It is really our crystallized knowledge, all of the knowledge and the vocabulary that we've accumulated over our life. So it's based on formal and informal learning experiences, educational experiences, conversations we've had, things we've read. This is one of our abilities that's pretty stable throughout life, and actually generally can increase over time because we're constantly learning new things. If you're reading, going to school, just engaging in meaningful conversation, this kind of builds throughout life. And this is one of the best predictors of overall intelligence. So our analogy with the librarian, they talk about when someone comes into a library, so meaning your brain, looking for information, you would expect the librarian to be able to recommend certain books. They would know where information is. They would know where and how to retrieve it. So this really assumes that we have the ability to access our long-term memory and retrieve information. And that librarian has a deep and broad knowledge base. And that knowledge base reflects all of the information that they've accumulated throughout their life, again, through reading or studying or listening, conversations, things like that. The librarian knows what information will specifically help in the problem that you're currently solving, and it only gives you the best information. So it doesn't give you irrelevant information and waste your time, and it tries to do so with a minimum amount of effort. So not a lot of prompting, not a lot of thought. It tries to retrieve that information efficiently. So students with a lower verbal comprehension index, they have more of an inefficient librarian. They might have a librarian that provides information that's not relevant. It doesn't actually help us to solve the problem that they're looking at. They might have a really shallow bank of knowledge, or they have very few books to give out, kind of maybe low vocabulary, not a lot of base knowledge. Or they might be unable to retrieve the knowledge, or only able to do so with a lot of significant effort. So that might be a lot of cueing, a lot of prompting to be able to pull that information out. The practical implications for someone with a lower verbal comprehension index often is weak vocabulary, which impacts comprehension when we are reading or when we're listening. There's often a lot of gaps in knowledge. So there's difficulty using some of the information that they've learned or applying that information across contexts. They also have difficulty using language, so they could have trouble communicating or finding the right words to communicate their thoughts, difficulty retrieving the exact word that they want to express what they want to say. Someone with a lower verbal comprehension will struggle with language, and so often we use simple language. Language that's concrete. We want to make sure we pre-teach vocabulary and repeat it frequently, especially if it is in a more complex subject. Maybe there's new science terms that are more difficult. We want to make sure we're pre-teaching that vocabulary and repeating it as much as possible. We want to make sure that we're creating a language-rich environment. Again, I think I talked about this in a previous presentation. If we are teaching language to a toddler, we don't only use the words that they know, we use all of the words. So it's the same with someone who struggles with verbal comprehension. We want to put them in a language-rich environment. We want to label things, talk through our thoughts, name things, define words when we're using them, repeat lots of instructions. We want to make sure that we're giving them lots of language to use, but when we're testing them, we want to make sure that we're only using the language that we know. So that's where that simple language comes in. We're using lots of visuals to support their language processing, kind of pairing those together to support that. And then reduce the amount that they have to work with language. This is still in that testing environment. If they have to write an essay, maybe they write less. That's a lot of language to work with. Or if they have to do an oral presentation, they can also do a demonstration where they're not just purely doing an oral presentation, which again would be a lot of language. Our next team member is the architect, and that's our visual spatial skills. The architect is really involved in seeing complex relationships visually. This area is the most susceptible to the effects of aging and brain damage. Just a little fact there. And really it's our ability to manipulate, synthesize, and transform patterns. It organizes visual information into meaningful patterns so we can interpret it. It understands how these visual patterns might change, or how seeing something in your mind can rotate through space, come together, come apart, things like that. It's also involved in differentiating left and right, looking at visual patterns, seeing visual information, comparing visual lengths and distances, reading charts, blueprints, scanning for information, extracting visual information, all of those visual spatial skills. The architect really is expected to do all of that really efficiently. So if you think of an architect, they might prepare a blueprint to build something. They're constructing those designs based on spatial relationships. And not only are they seeing it in their mind, but the image that they're seeing would be correct. It's actually going to be able to be created. It would be a structurally sound construction. There are different codes that it would make, that it would be up to. This would be more for building things physically, but also just seeing things in the mind. Also, we're making sure that the architect can organize visual information. So they know all the visual details. They're making a construction that is aesthetically pleasing. They're noticing all these details visually. So things to watch for a child who struggles with visual spatial skills. They might misunderstand or confuse symbols. Symbols being in math, maybe even reading. Letters are really just symbols. They might be distracted by visual information around them. If there's too much in their visual system, they might have difficulty judging distances, trouble differentiating similar shapes or numbers that look alike, weak in organizing visual information or scanning for one piece of information on the page. So often if we're doing a reading comprehension activity and you're scanning for information, maybe a word that you're looking for, that can be difficult. And they might also have difficulty with their fluidity of movement. Possibly if a student is trying to get by them and they're trying to get out of the way, their actual physical movement they may struggle with, and judging the distance on where they need to move and when. These students also typically have messy writing. They have difficulty staying in the lines, having their letters and sentences the same size, or in math, things like lining up their numbers in columns so that they can actually add the right things together. So if someone with lower visual spatial skills struggles with interpreting and manipulating visual information, we obviously want to reduce the amount of visuals presented to them and maybe teach things verbally. This doesn't mean that we take away all the visuals. These students would still do very well with visual schedules and visual reminders. They just have trouble interpreting that visual information. So if they want to interpret something like a graph or a chart that's relatively complex, we want to make sure that they're using verbal mediation. They're talking their way through that so that they're able to understand that, really that visual task in a more verbal means. We also want to provide physical manipulatives for visual tasks. So we're not just having the student see something in their mind, they can physically manipulate it and see how it moves rather than just seeing that image in their mind's eye, which is very difficult for them. We also want to make sure that there's less visually distracting information around them, not just in the classroom and on their desk, but in their work as well. They often do well with more white space on their paper, less questions or less distracting visual information if it's not needed, just because they have trouble managing all that visual information. So if it's more simple, it works better for them. Our next team member is the general manager, and that is the working memory index. The working memory index is our ability to immediately recall temporarily ordered elements. So it's our little chalkboard like you see here. It stores information so that we can perform an activity with it or a task. It also makes our mental processes run really efficiently. It decides what's important for us to work on, and it can prioritize information to work with. A general manager is expected, if you think of what their job would typically be, they manage orders from customers received within the brain. They control which orders to pay attention to based on importance, based on where they're going to assign them and the priority they need to be completed in. They also devise strategies to handle high work volumes. So they're very organized. They allow for a lot of multitasking, providing the correct resources to the correct brain regions to make sure that we're actually completing the job that we want to complete. An ineffective manager, so someone who struggles with working memory, they have really slow order processing. Maybe they're not allocating resources to the right places. They're not assigning work to the proper brain regions. They're not reserving enough space for the new orders that are coming in, and they don't have an organized workflow. Students with lower working memory have difficulty attending to and immediately recalling information they've just seen or heard. So their chalkboard there in their brain is smaller than their peers. So they have difficulty just holding on to that information while they're working with it. So they're often forgetful or they have gaps in their knowledge. They have difficulties writing sentences, especially. Written expression is very difficult. There's so much involved in remembering what you're writing. Remember spelling, punctuation, capitalization, that your first sentence flows with your next sentence and will flow with a sentence coming after. Writing is very complex for students with working memory deficits. They also have difficulty transferring information from source to source. So maybe copying notes from a smartboard to paper, or dictating information or writing dictated information. They have to be able to hold all that information in their mind and keep it in the same order while they're copying it down, which can be a large task. Students who struggle with working memory, we often see this in students who have difficulties with attention because they struggle with executive functions. Working memory is one of our executive functions. So you often see kids who are diagnosed with ADHD who struggle with working memory as well. So while they struggle with remembering and holding on to information, we accommodate that. So we give them less information, like shorter instructions. We use visuals so that they have that visual reminder that doesn't fade like an oral prompt would. We repeat instructions so that they're hearing the critical information over and over. We help them break down tasks into smaller pieces that take less time to complete so that they can work with less information and hopefully not forget any of that. We provide alternative ways to receive information. So if they're sitting in a lecture, instead of just listening to it, they can be given notes in advance, or they can be able to record the lecture. And really, we encourage those type of active listening strategies as well. Working memory, the last thing I'll say about it, it's our link from short-term memory to long-term memory. So working memory aids are really crucial for children who are not able to remember a lecture, for example, or not able to write down their notes fast enough to have a complete set of notes. So these students will require require accommodations, but they also require really purposeful strategies to help them put information into their long-term memory and encode information. So active listening strategies are very important. Other things like how to take notes or using shorthand, how to do that so that we can be more efficient really helps as well. Anything that we can offload information onto something physical or make something a little bit easier, that's what we want to do for working memory. Okay, our next team member is the clerk, and this is our processing speed. Processing speed is how quickly we can perform certain cognitive tasks. Typically it's simple or routine visual tasks, and processing speed is really involved in how fast and efficient we can think as well. So if we think of following along in a conversation or a lecture, that involves a lot of processing speed because you have to keep up with the content. Taking notes is a processing speed task as well. You have to keep up with and process that information as it comes along. If you fall behind, you're going to miss so much information. The clerk, in their analogy here, is really an entry-level position. So it doesn't really make any decisions. It doesn't decide what is important. It just does what it's told, and its job is to get it done as fast as it can without making any mistakes. It also identifies incomplete or missing information, and it can adapt to novel procedures, but generally it just makes sure that we work efficiently. So someone who struggles with processing speed, they're ineffective clerk. They might have incorrect information that they're writing down. They might fail to notice that they've written anything down incorrectly. They might complete work very slowly. They might not be organized or efficient. So often something that people notice right away is that the student just doesn't complete as much work as other students. So they're kind of working slowly, they're working inefficiently, they're not able to complete their work within the time that's given to them. They can also have trouble keeping up with conversations in class, kind of that lag time. They need more think time to be able to process that information. They have difficulties taking notes when the teacher is speaking. They have difficulty scanning for information or determining what is important on the page, again, for taking notes. And they have difficulty responding to questions, especially if they are not prepared for the questions. If you're calling on a student in class who has slow processing speed, that likely is going to be very, very difficult for them. So one of the biggest things that we do for sure for processing speed is provide more time. We want to make sure that there's no strain on the student who just needs more time to complete their work, or we want to give them fewer items to complete within the same time period so they know that they can be successful. We also want to give them more time to think of their answers verbally, more time to complete tests, fewer copying demands. We often focus on accuracy over completing work really quickly or completing more work. We reduce distractions. As we know, kids with attention difficulties also always have some sort of difficulty with processing speed. I guess I shouldn't say always, some of the time it's relatively common. So if they get distracted, it just takes so much more effort to come back to what they're doing and process that information all over again. So if we can reduce distractions, that helps. We want to avoid asking too many questions and give a lot of wait time. So I know in testing, this is something I always have to work with, that if I ask a question and I notice that someone is taking a long time to answer, I want to give them that wait time and not ask the question again. That just means they have to reprocess that question. Even if we think we're helping them by giving them a prompt, we want to make sure we've given them enough wait time to think through what they're going to say. We also can give tests with reduced written output. These students are slower to complete tasks and tests, so we want to make sure that we're giving them work that is at their level. They're going to have lower reading fluency, lower writing fluency, so we want to give them work maybe that is short answer instead of an essay or multiple choice, just so that they can get through a similar amount of work, but not take a very, very long time to do that. Our last team member is the detective, and this is our fluid reasoning. Fluid reasoning is most closely related to intelligence because it requires the integration of multiple cognitive abilities, and it requires them to all work together. Gifted students often have very strong fluid reasoning skills. Our fluid reasoning is so important. It's our ability to consider all of the facts, deduce underlying relationships, make inferences, put all of the relevant facts together, and it relies on all of the other team members that we talked about. So it relies on the librarian for vocabulary and facts. It relies on the architect to imagine how things would work. It relies on the clerk to process all of the facts efficiently. And it relies on the general manager to maintain focus, ignore distractions, and remember the information that you're trying to work with. So it allows everybody to work together with the common goal of solving a new problem. Kind of like I said, the detective is someone who makes all of the brain processes work together and really relies on them. They use detective because in their example, they want the detective to figure out all the facts from the environment. So if they're looking at a crime scene, their example is the library would have all of the knowledge on forensics that you would need to know about. So they're drawing on that background knowledge. It relies on the manager to maintain focus, ignore the facts that are not relevant to the crime. It relies on the clerk to process that information before the criminal gets away, or really we're just forgetting what we're doing. It knows where to look for clues. It develops a cohesive understanding of the events, and it really uses logic to understand a problem. It's able to narrow down the list of suspects, or really the list of answers that we're going through while we're reasoning through. So it goes through a logical sequence of events and arrives at a correct conclusion. A child who struggles with fluid reasoning, they might fail to draw from their relevant knowledge, or maybe they just have less knowledge to draw from. That's our librarian. Maybe they're unable to visualize relevant scenarios or different scenarios. That would be the architect. Maybe they can't prioritize or maintain focus on the most relevant facts in order to solve a problem, which would be the general manager, or they can't process information quickly, which would be the clerk. And even if sometimes they can do some of those things and you struggle with fluid reasoning, they might still draw an incorrect conclusion from all the facts that they've tried to put together. Difficulties in fluid reasoning, these kids often have a lot of difficulty with application questions. They struggle recognizing and forming and understanding concepts. They struggle perceiving relationships or patterns, understanding the implications of an issue or their actions. They have difficulties with complex problem solving, using logic, difficulties extrapolating information. So as someone with a lower fluid reasoning, they struggle to use logic. If you put them in a brand new situation to problem solve with, they will likely struggle quite a bit. So we want to teach in a really concrete and straightforward fashion. We also want to provide them with problem-solving frameworks instead of having them come up with their own. We want to make sure that we're giving them those step-by-step instructions on how to solve problems so they can memorize those steps. It's very difficult for them to come up with their own problem-solving process. And so we want to make sure that we're giving them a problem-solving process that works. We also want to use visuals and verbal information paired together. And when we're testing, back to that really concrete, specific. We're asking specific questions in testing, less open-ended questions. We really want to ask them exactly what knowledge we want to get at. And same thing for, I guess, larger questions that involve more writing. We want to make sure that they know what is expected of them. It can take problem solving to know if my application question that I've answered is correct. Have I answered everything? How do I know what I'm getting marked? Rubrics can help with those kind of things as well, not having them problem solve on their own. These students also struggle to generalize information. So they could learn a skill in one area, one class, one scenario, and then they're not able to use it in another scenario. Or you get the students who learn a problem-solving strategy in one scenario and they use it in every other scenario, even though it doesn't really fit. So they might have a logical problem-solving strategy, but it doesn't fit in the situation that they're trying to make it fit in, so their answer is still correct. A detective, so our fluid reasoning, if you have weakness in some areas, so maybe weakness in verbal comprehension or visual spatial skills, it obviously affects our fluid reasoning skills. If you have a low bank of knowledge to draw from, the detective might not be as strong because they have less information to take. If their clerk is really slow, they might not be able to problem solve with that information very quickly, so that detective needs more time, and they might possibly miss important information. So fluid reasoning I leave to last because it's so important and it just relies on all the other abilities to work together. The full-scale intelligence quotient is a score that comes out really from the entirety of the assessment. It is really a summary score that takes into account a couple of those subtests from all of the areas we talked about there: verbal comprehension, visual spatial, fluid reasoning, working memory, and processing speed. So it takes into account all of those. The summary score, it is usually a pretty good indication of a student's overall cognitive ability. However, often we see some discrepancy between those green scores there and the yellow scores. The green scores being our general ability. The general ability excludes the contributions of the working memory and processing speed. This is important for students who struggle with working memory and processing speed. A lot of our kids with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, they can have lower working memory and processing speed, but higher of those cognitive green abilities there, problem solving. And having those lower yellow abilities really affects the IQ score. So that's when, if you see a general ability index in a report, that's really those green abilities there to some extent. And if we look at just the yellow abilities, that's what we call cognitive proficiency. And that is just our working memory and processing speed who don't problem solve themselves. They just make it more efficient to problem solve, or more difficult. If you can hold a lot in your mind and process information really quickly, you're going to be a more efficient problem solver. However, if you can only hold a few items in your mind at a time and you require additional time to process information, you might forget what you were doing. You might only solve small bits of problem at a time. You might really be frustrated with the process that it takes so long to problem solve. So those are just a couple of scores that we see. Generally, we use the FSIQ as long as all of those green and yellow scores there are relatively consistent, just saying that it's a good overall picture of their general mental ability. And in research, it predicts things like school achievement, higher educational attainment, job advancement, career success. So just with the research they've done in putting together the assessment and what the IQ score can predict, there is some good research behind that and what it predicts. However, it is not the only thing that predicts those outcomes, obviously. It's really important that we know there's so many other factors that predict that we can't test. However, it's often useful to consider. And really the most important thing to consider, I would say, is all of the things that we've talked about, all of those primary mental abilities, all those team members that we just spoke about, because it gives the information on what the child struggles with, what they excel at, their patterns of strength and weakness. And so the one thing that I wanted to bring up that I often get asked is about learning styles, because it can be misunderstood that if a child has a higher area, for example, if they have higher visual spatial skills, that they're a visual learner, or if they have higher verbal comprehension skills, they're an auditory learner. So that's not really the case. And so just briefly about learning styles, we do want to use cognitive strengths in learning from the assessment. So if a student has a higher area, we want to make sure we're encouraging the student to use that. However, it's not saying that the student is a specific type of learner, and that they should only learn one way, because research doesn't support that. Learning styles really say that there's one instructional way to teach a student. And if that's used, the student will learn the material, or they'll learn it the best. When in reality, research states that students have multiple learning styles, all of them. So visual, kinesthetic, auditory, and they use a bunch of them together all the time. Learning styles puts people in these neat little boxes, which human brains like to do. We like to organize and categorize and make sense of information that way. But there's a couple problems with learning styles. First, they're based on questionnaires that students complete often about themselves, and we know that we're often wrong about ourselves. Research supports cognitive strengths and weaknesses, tapping into strengths and accommodating for the weakness, but it doesn't mean that there's only one style of teaching that's used. Students learn through many methods together, and using one of those, research says, produces no better outcome in learning. Learning styles also undermines the knowledge of teachers, saying that they have to teach in one certain way to allow students to learn. Teachers know how to teach. That's what they do. They know what works for their students. They know that they can combined methods together. They went to school. They are so knowledgeable on the topic that they know what to do, and saying that they need to teach one way really just undermines all of the knowledge that they have. The other problem is that having students believe they only learn one way. So for example, a student who thinks that they are an auditory learner, maybe they'll just listen in class, not take notes or draw pictures for their learning. That would be really detrimental to their learning. Thinking that they are auditory and they can just listen and that's how they learn. So while we want to accommodate for weakness, it doesn't really mean that we completely avoid everything else. That student who thinks they are an auditory learner and they're not doing anything else, that's quite troublesome. So an example just to illustrate the difference between a cognitive weakness and the learning style. So for example, if a student has weak visual spatial skills, we wouldn't abandon visuals, saying that they don't understand them. They will have difficulty interpreting the visual information, but we still use visuals. We use visual cues and schedules and reminders in the classroom. It would help to realize that if you're giving the student a purely visual task, maybe scanning for important information in text, maybe they just need more time to do that, or they need less text to sort through because they struggle to interpret in visual information. It doesn't mean they can't do the task or that we don't do the task because they don't learn visually. It just means that we need to accommodate them, but definitely they can still use visuals. Briefly go through interpretation. Mostly what I wanted to talk about here was just the significant areas. So we see here the blue range is more of our average functioning. And then when we get more significant, we're talking about this purple and yellow range down here. That is significant because those scores are really significantly below same-aged peers. So kind of starting here and going down. The low average and high average range together, those are the broad average range. And scores within that range are generally age appropriate. I will talk about this low average range and what we called borderline intelligence or slow learners. That's kind of what we called it before. It's kind of that 71 to 84 IQ range in here. A little bit into the purple area, but we don't use this classification anymore, but there is some merit into looking into those kids because they often have more negative outcomes than their peers. When we program for these kids here, we're often having specialized learning, whereas these kids, they're kind of a different category and sometimes they fall between the cracks. So that's what I wanted to talk about with slow learners because they can be so difficult to program for. They're not necessarily achieving at grade level. They're not on par with what's expected of them, but they're not necessarily the ones you focus on because they're not your lowest achieving children. The lowest achieving children, again, they often receive modified work because they might be clearly unable to complete grade level material. So I don't focus on those kids because we do a pretty good job at altering the program of studies for those kids and being able to do different grade level math. Let's say we're doing grade level 4 in grade 9, or they're doing functional math or life skills, things like that. But the slow learners, they can really appear as though they are quite able, so they can be puzzling as to why they struggle so much in the classroom. It's not as clear what they should be working on. They're behind, but maybe not enough to think about changing their program of studies. And these kids are what some of the researchers call slow learners. A high proportion of these kids are retained. They drop out of school. They're more likely to use drugs, be aggressive, be underemployed, unemployed. They have more mental health problems. Typically, they don't qualify for specialized services in adulthood. So we're talking about PDD and H. These students also typically have lower self-esteem. They learn slower than their peers, despite not really having any apparent differences. They likely never fully catch up to their peers, and they have more difficulties elsewhere. So something like attention, they probably struggle with as well. Generally, lower cognition means lower mental abilities overall. So that might be lower executive functions, lower attention, maybe even lower speech and memory as well. So I bring this group up specifically just because they have more of those negative mental health outcomes, simply because their IQ is just too high to qualify for some of those really specialized services or to receive that designation where they might have an adapted program of studies. So they're just often missed as a student who isn't achieving at grade level, and we're not sure why. So this is what the research says about slow learners. Just a couple things to help them in their learning. They need information that is concrete. So some of these you'll see are similar to what we looked at with fluid reasoning, that detective, because there's a lot of similarities. So they need concrete learning. They struggle with abstract information. It's so much more difficult for them to learn. They need to see it, feel it, touch it, do it, experience it, act it out, do experiments, learn through experience. They also need help generalizing information. So they struggle to transfer their knowledge. They can definitely learn the material, but they may not generalize it to different situations. They typically have a good memory, so long-term memory or rote memory, as all of the other students, but they're slower in that they struggle to fully learn and master a concept and then apply that concept. So many learning opportunities that teachers have, they teach a general rule, and that's expected to just be applied to new situations with minimal guidance. So you teach a rule and then you expect the children to go on about their work and apply that rule. However, the slow learners may be able to recite the strategy to you, but they struggle to know how, when, and where to apply the rule. They need guidance on that and when, where, how to use that skill. So for example, they would know that 1 + 1 is 2, and then most students would generalize that 1 + 2 is 3, whereas slow learners need to be explicitly taught that 1 + 2 is 3. They can't generalize that information generally. They also need help with executive functions. Again, if you have lower cognition, generally you have lower abilities other places as well, like executive functions. They struggle to organize new information or assimilate incoming information into their previously acquired knowledge. They also struggle with a lot of other things like time management, setting goals, a lot of executive functions. But with making new information fit in with what they know, lessons that start with review are often very helpful. So telling them how the information that you're going to teach them fits into what they already know, it really helps organize that information for them and tie it together so that we're anchoring that information into something that they already have learned. Practice is another one. These students need so much more repetition and practice to get a concept than a typical learner would. They benefit from more academically engaged time, so that's time on task, to develop the same level of academic skills as their peers. Research says that slow learners don't necessarily need to be taught slower. They just need accommodations for when they're required to communicate what they know. So less questions, more time, things like that. And they need more practice. So there's a little bit of an iffy subject here. Some of the research says that these children need more practice than their peers, which is difficult in my opinion, because these students are so much more mentally fatigued by the end of the day that they're not going to want to do more homework, and you're going to get into that fight at home of completing more work, or they're not going to want to stay in class to complete work from at recess time. These students probably are the ones that benefit the most from recess time. So I would take this just as we're making sure that they have ample time to practice the skills they need, and that we're just giving them a lot of time to practice and not necessarily piling on more work, just really maximizing the time that we have. The last one is certainly not only applicable to slow learners, but connecting with adults in the building. The close relationships with teachers really help these students because they have a lack of motivation for school, especially when we're getting into later elementary, junior high, and for sure high school. Being that slow learner category comes with just a lack of motivation for school, as would make sense. If it's so much more difficult for you, the motivation likely drops off as well. So having that connection with at least someone in the building really helps with that motivation and wanting to still learn. Very briefly, the academic assessment. I won't go through it like the cognitive assessment, just so you're familiar with what some of the academic assessments are. With our level B testing and Chinook's Edge, we use the KT. Other assessments for psychoeducational assessments, you might see these more often, just to know what you're seeing. And they all, to some extent, look at the same thing: reading, writing, spelling, math. sometimes oral language, listening comprehension in a bunch of different areas, orthographic processing, reading comprehension, math, reasoning, a bunch of things. So we do these tests really to look at things like learning disorders. However, we also do them to observe what kind of struggles the student has in the classroom that we don't get from scores. So the scores are important, but when you do things like a level B assessment, you can see that the student might be struggling to find the ideas that they're writing about. So they can write, but they just struggle to start and continue with their ideas. Or they're not able to line up their numbers in math, so their math is often incorrect. These are also really important considerations that you can often find in a report. And if you do level B testing, you know that these are very important to consider along with the scores. And for those doing level Bs, be aware that academic tasks can also look at other things as well, which is why it's important not to just take the scores without considering anything else, and which is why we don't diagnose learning disorders from just having a level B. So things like a reading task, it can also look at vocabulary. If the student has low vocabulary or low access to written content, they might struggle with reading tasks more often. Also processing speed and working memory. If you process slower or you working memory, you forget what you're reading, that can interfere with reading comprehension. If they weren't in a language-rich environment during their early years, that also significantly impacts reading. When we're looking at writing tasks, it also assesses executive functions. That's one of the biggest ones. So working memory, organization, planning, sustained attention, even behavioral inhibition or self-monitoring, flexibility, all of those are within each writing task. So we want to make sure that if we're struggling with writing, we're also considering executive functions. It might be language ability as well, their vocabulary. If you have a lower vocabulary, it's going to be more difficult to articulate exactly what you want to in writing. Obviously, writing also looks at fine motor skills or their ability to sit still for a long period of time. Math, very similar. A lot of them involve working memory processing speed. It also might be fluid reasoning, so using problem-solving strategies flexibly, or visual spatial reasoning is often one that we see in math as well. Fluency tasks, so when I see kids who struggle with writing fluency, math fluency, reading fluency, those are largely processing speed tasks as well as attention. So if we're struggling with fluency tasks, those can be some underlying areas there, or difficulty with the fluid recall of information. So taking that information from long-term memory and taking it out to use right now efficiently, that can be difficulty if in a fluency task if they struggle with that as well. So just something here that it's important to consider all of the information for the student, what you see, not only the academic scores, but what you're observing, cognitive assessment, all of those things together. That's really what's important. On this one, I just wanted to really draw your attention to the differences in descriptors. So these are different academic assessments that we see here. Academic tests tend to use different descriptors, and by descriptors I mean these words that describe some of the scores. They use different descriptors than cognitive tests often. When you read reports, some psychologists will match the descriptors from the cognitive to the academic assessment, so they're the same. So you know that low is this area here, those standard scores across the cognitive and academic measure. Sometimes they don't, so you have to be aware when you're reading, if someone says they're in the low average range, what they mean by that. Make sure you're looking at those scores. So you can see also that they're different from test to test often. So low in this area here is 55 to 69, but low here is 70 to 79. So often the descriptors are what parents look at. They're much easier to understand, but make sure when you're looking at the assessment that you're making your accommodations or your interventions from these scores, if your brain works in standard scores or percentile ranks, because those will be consistent across tests where these tend to change. Just making sure that you are aware of that and that's how you're interpreting the assessments. Lastly, I just wanted to talk about what to read in an assessment report. I understand that assessments are generally written for other psychologists. So if a child receives a private assessment and it comes to the school board, typically it's for a psychologist to receive to help with the interpretation. That's why it contains a lot of information that's not really essential for parents or educators to go through to appropriately plan for that student. Generally, the psychologist would go through the report and be able to have all that information, all the charts and the scores, so that they would logically come to the same conclusion that the other psychologist in the report. However, I know they can be 8 pages long, they can be 40 pages long. So there's really only certain parts that are important to read to make an educational decision, especially if you don't really need to read all 40 pages or you're in a time crunch. So the background, summary, and recommendations would be the 3 that I would say are the most important. The background gives information that really helps to understand the student and is often a part of a report that's missed or just glossed over. So it might give any previous diagnosis, it might give educational information, so report card marks or comments, maybe information on the educational style that the student was taught in. If they've moved to a school and they were previously in French immersion, or they had literacy or numeracy supports, that would be important to know. Maybe they've been absent from school for a long period of time, or they have significant medical concerns, they take medications, or they have significant intervention for behavioral, social, emotional functioning. They've accessed supports. It might tell you what has worked and what hasn't worked. The next one is to kind of just skip on down to the summary. Hopefully the summary is a story that ties that background information together with the current assessment findings to explain not only what the difficulties that the child is having, but why they're having those difficulties. So the summary is often a really important part that puts all that information together. It typically also includes any diagnoses that are in there. Obviously, the next section is the recommendations. Those are the suggestions that are based on the assessment, their cognitive profile, academic profile, and then any other factors that the assessment looked at. So I didn't go over rating scales, social emotional functioning, their adaptive functioning, executive functions. There's so many other things that we can look into. That's what we do through rating scales. So hopefully the recommendations would include that information as well. If they're diagnosed with autism or ADHD, or they have anxiety, you're going to see recommendations for that as well, because that would be very relevant to their school functioning. Lastly, the assessments result section, that's more within the body of the report. Sometimes you'll see those charts within the report. Sometimes the charts will be at the end. These 2 sections, the assessment results and the tables and charts, are not really necessary to fully understand the assessment. Again, all of that information should be in the summary and the recommendations. So that's just more so for other psychologists' use. Feel free to read through the whole report to get a good understanding of the student. It's just that if you are less familiar with psychological reports, then those are the ones that I would say you could skip over and still fully understand how to program for a student. The only other section I would bring up is sometimes you might see something that says diagnostic considerations, might be less common. This is also important because it obviously gives a diagnosis in that section. Otherwise, it's typically contained within the summary. Be mindful that some reports will put a diagnosis in bold and that you'll see it very clearly, and others kind of hide it within a paragraph somewhere in the summary of the report. So if you see that, feel free to highlight those for other people so they are able to find it easier and then understand the student better. Often I also encourage teachers to go through, make a copy of the recommendations and highlight the ones that they think that they should use. Definitely not all of them, maybe pick 1 or 2. I know a lot of psychologists like to give a lot of recommendations, and that's more so to make it a working document. Again, to make sure that the assessment is usable beyond the year it's done, that you can go back to it and say, we've tried this, it didn't work, let's try the next one. Or yes, we did this, let's go on to a more complex version, we're doing really well with this intervention or this accommodation. So feel free to go back to the report, highlight, copy the recommendations so that you are able to see them and use them for however it works in your classroom, and adapt them for your classroom. Not all of them will work with your teaching style, and feel free to kind of adapt them to what will work for you.